Well, it's that time of year. Everyone's going Christmas shopping. Game developers are pushing all their latest titles like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Halo. And if you're an Xbox player like myself, it meant that you were paying attention to Forza Horizon 5. This past Thanksgiving, I spent a good chunk of time just delving into the game and rediscovered one of my favorite cars of all time, the Renault R5 Turbo. If you're not familiar with it, well, I don't fault you. It's a very niche vehicle from an era of cars that a lot of people just aren't aware of anymore, and more importantly, it's French. Most people, when they think of aftermarket car culture, they're thinking of things like Japanese sports cars, German cars, even American muscle cars. They're not thinking of French cars because, well, the reputation of French cars is often set by the precedent of Top Gear. They're usually spat upon, dissed at, and treated as econoboxes or things that you use as a first car or use for menial service. You don't think of them all as sports cars, even though there are iconic names in there like the 901 or the Renault Megane. And that got me thinking. I love the Renault R5 Turbo myself, so why aren't French cars sold here in America? Well, today, I hope we get to answer that question. How's it going, guys? My name is Nick Lanza, and this is Car Rant, where we do a number of types of videos, from reviews to builds and stuff like this, discussion type videos. So, if you're interested in stuff like building our Evo 8 or engine swapping our S13 with a Beans motor, stick around because that's stuff that we've got coming up further down the pipeline. And if you're interested in it, please consider subbing. Without further ado, let's get into this video. French cars at one point in time were sold globally around the world to a number of different types of markets, and as a result, take it with a grain of salt the perspective of the people in those markets. Not all cars are made for all places. For example, here in America, a muscle car makes tons of sense because we have big highways and lots of space to use it on, plus much more affordable gas prices. But in a place like the UK, Ford Mustang doesn't really make a lot of sense. To start, let's talk about the French cars in America right now. What's actively being sold to our market that we just may not realize is actually French? Well, one of the most commonly seen cars in any city in America would be the Smart car. Smart Fortwo is actually made in France by Mercedes-Benz. And the Toyota Yaris, though owned by a Japanese company, is also made in France. But what about a car that's distinctly French? Well, the only car that's sold in America that is uniquely and distinctly French is the Bugatti Chiron. So, not exactly something that any Joe Schmo could buy. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, what about companies like Peugeot and Renault? Like, these are bigger names. How come they're not sold here? Well, it's due to a very, very poor sales history. See, going all the way back into the 40s, when we didn't have import laws, people could just bring cars over on boats and wait for them to show up. And one of the first companies to do that was the Simca brand. And they actually didn't do all that bad being sold here. They were based on a Ford model and eventually were taken over by Chrysler, at least for their sales here in the States. They didn't sell a lot. In fact, their total numbers are in the few hundreds instead of multiples of thousands. So, arguably not crazy successful. At the time, for an era where there were many, many brands, possibly. But in our eyes today, not really. Now, while that is a small David in a field full of Goliaths like Peugeot, well, what did the Goliaths do? Peugeot just kind of, for lack of better terms, was always seen as a lower end car by people here in the States and abroad, from what I can tell, you know, talking to my friends from overseas and being in Europe myself several years ago. Most people see Peugeot as like your perfect rental car. And here in the States, that was kind of the same impression. They tried to sell to the taxi cab industry, to which they sold everything at a loss. And the general populace just wasn't that interested in them. I mean, sure, they were sold during a time when economy was very heavily sought after, but when you could buy a Honda Civic or something of similar caliber for a lot cheaper, most people went with a cheaper option. Inversely, a car that actually did sell relatively well, but unfortunately was not very well kept, was stuff like the Renault R5. See, prior to that model, we had the Dauphine, and that was a car that people were not very happy with. Most people actually abandoned those things on the side of the road because, well, if you lived in a colder state, it most likely wasn't going to start. And if you lived in the South, it most likely was going to rust and fall apart. It just didn't have the reliability nor the functionality that other American cars could offer. But with the R5, Renault actually had something that people had some level of interest in, but they didn't sell a ton of. Yeah, several thousands were sold, and that's good, but because Renault is such a niche brand and wasn't underneath one of the big umbrellas like General Motors or Ford Motor Company, it was very hard to get parts. You had to wait a long time to get them, and as a result, they just couldn't stick around in the American market for very long. They had better luck tying their hands with other American companies and even other foreign subsidiaries than trying to do it themselves. And this is what's helped Renault stay in business even today, despite being a state-owned company. In fact, one of the few cars that actually was loved by the people who bought them were the Citroën DS models, and those were sold for quite a long time, from about the early 50s up until 1973. And after that, well, there's a very clear reason why they couldn't sell. The DS came onto the scene. It was very super futuristic. It was much like the Datsun Z years later in its design, but it just couldn't compare to other cars at the time. Things like the Corvair were cars that actually helped derail the Citroën success here in America. So it's very clear to see that it had very staunch competition. No matter what brand you were, if you were French, you had a lot of work stacked against you. So, like I had mentioned earlier, Peugeot, really Nissan, had the right idea to partner with other brands here in the States to sell some of their products. And you'd be surprised at some of the things that have had French influence. Namely, the most iconic car of the 80s, the DMC-12 DeLorean, was Peugeot powered. Leave it to John DeLorean to put a weaker French motor into an insanely heavy shell. Let's just say the reason for the 88 miles an hour in a DeLorean was such a funny joke at the time was because, if you ever knew anything about them, going that fast took a long time. Inversely, with Renault, some of the most iconic cars of today are still around because of the fact that they bought into some American companies. American Motor Company was one such example. They actually owned the Jeep brand, and when they had taken over a large controlling share of AMC, that meant that they also had control over Jeep. And by proxy, it kept AMC from going bankrupt and thus kept the Jeep brand alive just a bit longer until it finally was sold to Chrysler. And realistically, had Renault not bought into AM, we would have never had stuff as iconic as the Jeep Rubicon. And that leads us to today, where the only three vehicles sold in America that are French made are a supercar, an economy car, and literally the smart car. Not a good showing for a nation that has had such an incredible history, whether it be tearing down tyrants, conquering half the world, or teaching the world to use soap. France has had a very large impact on our culture. In fact, what we perceive to be high society luxury is largely in part due to the French. So why is it that a nation that has such pedigree has such paltry vehicles? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that many of the French-built cars were made by the state, and as a result, they were made specifically to French people, not to anyone and whosoever will. So where does that leave us? Will we see a Renault Megane being sold here in the States? Not likely. As it sits, Peugeot has plans to try to make it into America come 2026, but as it sits right now, no one's really sure what's gonna happen. But with the electrification of vehicles being more widely accepted and the globalization of electric cars being very accessible, there's a good chance that we might see French electric cars being sold here well before we ever see French gas-powered cars here. Well, with that said, what are your thoughts? Let me know down in the comment section below. Do you think we'll ever see French cars sold here like they used to? Or do you think that they will be on par competitors with things like the Volt and the Nissan Leaf and even Tesla? Let me know down below. I would love to hear your thoughts because I do read every comment and I love to be included in y'all's conversations down there. It is a lot of fun, some of the things that we can get into. And more importantly, what's your favorite French car if you have one? Me personally, like I said, love the R5 Turbo. Will forever be one of my favorite cars of all time. And if I could afford one, I would totally buy one because those things are crazy and you could drive from Florida to Maine on one tank of gas. And that sounds like a really fun video to make for an episode of Car Rant. Without further ado, God bless you guys, and we'll see you next time. Peace.